Xenonauts 2 doesn't hold your hand. And honestly, that's exactly what makes the game so satisfying. But there's a huge difference between suffering because the game is hard and suffering because no one explained how it actually works. After spending way too many hours watching my soldiers die from avoidable mistakes, I've put together 10 advanced tips that completely changed how I play. Whether you've just picked up the 1.0 version or have been playing in early access for a while, I'm sure at least a few of these will make all the difference. Let's dive in. If there's one thing I learned playing the 1.0 version, it's that the battlefield isn't flat, and ignoring that will cost your soldiers their lives. The developers made the verticality system much more straightforward in this final version. Being on a higher level than your target grants a plus 0.10x accuracy modifier per level of difference. This means positioning your soldiers on roofs, upper windows, and elevated structures isn't just aesthetic, it's pure math in your favor. Think about what that means in practice. A sniper positioned 2 floors above the enemy is already operating with a plus 20% hit chance before even considering the soldier's skill or the distance to the target. Put that same sniper on a roof with an open line of sight, and they literally become a god of the battlefield. I completely replanned my approach to urban missions after I understood this. Every map with multi-story buildings became an opportunity, not an obstacle. But here comes the side many people forget. The modifier works both ways. If you are below the enemy, the penalty is -0.10x per level of difference. In other words, sending a soldier to attack an alien on a warehouse roof while your guy is on the ground is basically wasting an action. I've taken some harsh punishments for being careless like that, especially on maps where Reapers or flying enemies naturally occupy elevated positions. So the real advice here is, before making any move, read the map's elevation. Aliens above you punish you severely, but the reverse situation is absurdly powerful. Prioritize roofs for your snipers, use stairs and structures to gain a vertical advantage before opening fire, and treat any enemy in an elevated position as a priority threat. Xenonauts 2 rewards those who think three-dimensionally, and this height mechanic is one of the most impactful in the game. It took me a long time to understand the real value of the Mars. For a long time, I only used the tank as a direct damage unit, sending it forward to absorb fire. It was watching other people play in Iron Man mode that I realized I was completely wasting this unit's potential. The Mars can crash through walls and physical cover, and that opens up tactical possibilities I simply hadn't considered. The most practical application I learned is using the Mars as an improvised door opener. You know that classic situation where you know an alien is waiting for you on the other side of a door? In Overwatch, instead of sending a soldier through the conventional entrance and hoping they don't take a shot to the face, you just send the tank through the adjacent wall and flank the enemy from an angle they weren't expecting. It seems obvious when someone tells you, but I hadn't made that connection on my own. Inside UFOs, this gets even more interesting. The ships usually have narrow corridors that heavily favor defending aliens and creating an improvised entrance. With the Mars, completely messes up their positioning. It's not a tactic I invented. It's practically standard among Iron Man players, where you simply can't afford to lose soldiers on poorly planned entries. What impressed me most was discovering that the tank does this with no extra TU cost, the time units that determine how many actions you have in a turn. So there's no penalty at all for using this movement. If you, like me, were underutilizing the Mars, it's worth rethinking its role in your squad. It can be much more than a walking shield. Look, I don't consider myself the smartest Xenonauts 2 player, but there's one thing I learned after taking quite a beating in missions. Electroshock grenades deserve a lot more attention than I gave them at first. What caught me by surprise was discovering that their stun damage ignores armor, and that changes a lot when planning a turn. When I started facing robotic units like cyber drones, I admit I panicked a few times, not really knowing how to deal with them. It was through trial and error that I realized these grenades deal heavy EMP damage to this type of enemy. Androns are on this list, too. It's not exactly a secret, but it's the kind of thing that makes a difference when you figure it out in practice. There's another detail that took me a while to notice. The electroshock removes Overwatch from the hit enemy. For those still learning the system, Overwatch is when the alien goes into reaction mode to shoot your soldier as soon as they move. When I realized I could disable that before advancing, I started using the grenade in a very different way. I don't know if the most broken grenade in the game is the right title, but I understand why many veterans call it that. It solves several difficult situations at once, and for me, who made silly mistakes trying to ignore the equipment inventory, it was one of the most useful discoveries of my playthrough. It's worth keeping a few at the base whenever possible. Air combat was one of the parts I got stuck on the most at the beginning. I simply sent my aircraft straight at the UFO and hoped it could endure enough to shoot it down. And obviously, I lost a lot of ships that way. It was while trying to better understand the system that I stumbled upon a tactic more experienced players call the flick shot. And it completely changed how I approach these engagements. The idea is simpler than it seems. You fire your laser or fusion weapons the moment you're within range, and immediately use the afterburner to quickly back away before the enemy can respond effectively. Once the distance increases, you repeat the cycle. Approach, shoot, retreat. In theory, it sounds a bit tedious, but in practice, it's incredibly effective, especially when your aircraft isn't the toughest. What surprised me most was realizing that you can take down much larger UFOs while taking almost no damage using this approach. I had the impression that smaller aircraft were basically disposable against large ships. So I kept postponing these confrontations, waiting for better equipment. But the flick shot essentially neutralizes the enemy's durability advantage if you maintain the discipline of not staying in their range for too long. I won't pretend I've mastered this perfectly. I still mess up the timing sometimes and take unnecessary damage. But it's the kind of tactic that once you understand the logic behind it, you start applying naturally. If you were also avoiding air combat against larger targets out of fear of losing aircraft, it's highly worth testing this strategy before giving up on the mission. One of the things that caught me most by surprise in Xenonauts 2 was realizing that the Doomsday Clock can spiral out of control much faster than it seems on higher difficulties. For a long time, I ignored this system, focusing only on tactical missions and thinking things would sort themselves out naturally. When I finally stopped to understand how alien progress works, I was already in a very complicated situation to reverse. What I learned the hard way is that security-focused ops agents, the supporters, are the correct way to reduce the clock's daily advance. I kept allocating agents to other functions, thinking I was optimizing my campaign, but I was basically letting the ticker grow every day without doing anything about it. When I started prioritizing these security agents, the feeling of losing control decreased a lot. But the detail that really changed my approach was understanding the importance of capturing the alien general in base missions. I confess that the first few times I faced this type of mission, I went into total destruction mode without thinking about capturing. Only later did I realize that taking down the general alive provides extra operations that are vital to hold back the clock, especially when you're playing on higher difficulties and every op point counts. I'm no expert in strategic campaign management, but these two things together, correctly allocated supporters and capturing the general, made a huge difference in my playthrough. If you, like me, were treating the Doomsday Clock as a problem to solve later, it's worth rethinking that priority before the clock reaches a point where the entire campaign falls apart. I made a classic mistake in my first few hours of Xenonauts 2 that I bet a lot of people also make. I tried to do everything in all bases at the same time. Research, manufacturing, hangars, soldiers. I wanted each base to be completely self-sufficient. The result was that none of them worked properly, space was poorly utilized, and I was always running out of resources at the wrong time. It was when I started to understand how building adjacency bonuses work that it clicked. When you group buildings of the same or complementary types, they boost each other, and this only really works if you planned that base with a specific purpose from the start. Trying to mix everything in the same space not only wastes these bonuses, but also messes up the layout for any future expansion. The separation that made the biggest difference for me was dedicating the initial base to research and building the second base focused on manufacturing with workshops. It sounds simple when someone says it like that, but it took me a while to make that decision because I felt like I was delaying something by not putting labs in the second base too. In practice, the opposite is true. Specialization speeds everything up. If you're building your second base now and haven't decided on its focus yet, it's worth taking a moment to think about it before placing the first building. This initial planning saves a lot of headaches later on. There's a situation I faced several times without quite understanding what was happening. My own soldiers blocking each other's line of fire in narrow corridors, especially inside UFOs. I kept repositioning everyone during the turn, wasting time units for nothing, and even then, the sniper in the back couldn't get a clear line of sight. Only after a while did I realize I was ignoring one of the simplest and most useful mechanics in the game. The solution has a very descriptive name within the community: crouch over shoulder. The idea is to always end the frontline soldiers' turn crouching. When they are in a low stance, the snipers and riflemen positioned behind them can shoot over them without any penalty and without the risk of friendly fire. It seems like a small detail, but it completely changes the combat dynamics in tight spaces. Inside UFOs, this is especially valuable. The corridors are narrow by design, and the game favors aliens waiting in defensive positions in these situations. When I started applying this formation, frontline crouching, support troops shooting over, I gained much more control over who shoots and when, without having to juggle positioning every turn. I didn't learn this right away, and I paid the price in a few missions with soldiers wounded due to careless placement. But it's one of those mechanics that once it enters your routine, you do almost automatically. If you don't have the habit of crouching the front line before ending the turn yet, it's worth starting to practice, especially when the mission takes you inside an alien ship. One of the most painful lessons I learned was ignoring soldier attributes during recruitment. In the beginning, I accepted anyone who showed up, prioritized level and equipment, and thought base attributes were just details. Then the end game arrived with alien psychic attacks, and I quickly understood how wrong I was regarding bravery. Soldiers with low bravery simply crumble when subjected to psychic pressure, and in the late game, that pressure appears much more frequently than you'd expect. Today, I don't accept recruits with less than 55 bravery, and I prefer it when someone with 60 or more arrives. It might seem picky early in the campaign, but it's exactly the kind of thing that makes a difference when you least want to deal with it. Strength was another attribute I underestimated for a long time. I didn't quite understand how the weight system worked until I started noticing my soldiers reaching the end of their turn without enough to use to do much. Then I realized that carrying extra grenades and additional ammo comes with a cost, and strength is what determines how much you can carry without suffering a penalty to time units. A soldier with low strength carrying heavy equipment is basically a slow soldier on the field. I'm not the type of player who optimizes every detail from minute one, but I learned to check bravery and strength before anything else on the recruitment screen. A soldier with good base numbers in those two attributes is worth much more than one with slightly better combat stats and weak fundamental attributes. If you're in the early stages of the campaign, it's worth building this habit now before the game starts making you pay for it. If you've made it this far, it's probably because you already know what it's like to take a shot from a heavily armored civilian and feel like your entire squad is shooting rubber bullets at it. I've lost too many good soldiers trying to take down these tanks through brute force until I understood that the game doesn't want you to force it. It wants you to think before you shoot. The turning point was when I started using demolition grenades and satchel charges as the first step of combat, not as a last resort. Most people only use these tools to destroy cover, which is already great. But what many don't realize is that they also break the enemy's physical armor at the point of impact, leaving the target exposed in a way that completely changes the math of the round. And the best part of this strategy is exactly what it frees up next. You no longer need to save your heavy weapons for these armored enemies. After a good detonation, even a soldier with a low caliber rifle can deal relevant damage. This means you can distribute threats among more soldiers, save expensive ammo, and still keep the pressure on multiple targets simultaneously. So next time a seemingly immortal enemy appears, resist the urge to unload everything on them at once. Send a demolition grenade first, let the armor go along with the cover, and only then let the rest of the squad finish the job. Xenonauts 2 rewards those who think in sequence, and this tip is proof of that. One of the most common traps I fell into was the temptation to sell old jets as soon as a new model became available. It seems logical at the time. You need money, the plane seems too weak to remain useful, and that extra cash in the account sounds really good. But I'll tell you from my own experience, that decision will cost you much more later on. What I learned is that these obsolete jets still have a lot of work to do, It's just not the work you were having them do before. Instead of sending them to the scrapyard, redirect them to your secondary and tertiary bases. While your elite fleet is busy hunting the large aggressive alien ships, these veterans resting in the smaller bases can cover interceptions of small UFOs that spawn far from your center of operations. And this detail of global coverage makes an absurd difference in the campaign's progression. Without this protection, smaller UFOs roam freely across the map, build alien presence in regions you barely look at, and suddenly you're losing funding from countries that felt abandoned. With old jets patrolling these regions, you maintain global pressure without having to buy elite models in triplicate just to cover the map. It's the kind of efficiency the game barely explains directly, but it separates those who survive on higher difficulties from those who restart the campaign out of frustration. An old fleet isn't a weakness. It's infrastructure. Treat these jets as second-line workers, and they'll pay back every cent you saved by not selling them.